The blue light filled the entire United Nations Assembly Hall and made everyone look strange and ghostly in its glow, and the alien that appeared in the hologram was tall and frightening with armor that seemed to be made of crystal or glass that pulsed with light from inside. And this was Ambassador Zekther of the Kavalian Imperium, who had traveled across the stars to deliver a message that would change everything for humanity and for Earth itself. The alien spoke, and the translation came through in a cold voice that had no emotion in it at all. And he said that humans of Earth had been evaluated by something called the Galactic Council, and that Earth must submit to Imperium authority within 30 days or face military action. And the way he said it made it clear that he expected no resistance and no argument from the primitive species that lived on this small blue world. President Helen Morrison stood up from her seat, and her face showed no fear even, though everyone in the room felt it, and she asked the alien on what grounds he made this demand, and why humanity should bow to people from another world who knew nothing about Earth or its history, or its people. The alien named Zekther looked at her with his 4 eyes and explained that humans were violent and chaotic and refused to follow the established protocols of civilized space, and that Earth had expanded into 3 star systems without permission from the Council, and that humans waged war amongst themselves, which proved they were dangerous and needed to be controlled like animals in a cage. He continued, speaking, and said that the Kavalian Imperium had subjugated 217 species already, and that humanity would become number 218, and the way he said it suggested that this was supposed to be an honor, rather than a threat, as if humans should be grateful to be conquered by such a powerful force. Admiral Jack Peters sat forward in his chair and studied the alien carefully, because he had seen that kind of arrogance before in dictators and tyrants throughout human history, and he recognized the posture of someone who had never truly been challenged or faced real resistance in battle, and he filed that information away in his mind for later use. Helen asked what would happen if humanity refused the demand, and the alien said that the Kavalian Armada would reduce human cities to ash, and that they had never lost a war and did not expect to start losing now. And then the transmission ended abruptly and left the assembly in stunned silence that lasted only a few seconds before chaos erupted. Some of the delegates from various nations started shouting that Earth should surrender immediately to save lives, while others demanded that humanity fight back and never bow to alien oppressors. And the room became so loud that Helen had to raise her hand and wait for silence before she could speak again. She turned to Admiral Jack Peters and asked him what options Earth had against this alien threat, and Jack stood up with his weathered face looking grim but not defeated, and he explained that their deep space sensors had been tracking the Valian fleet and counted approximately 400 warships entering the solar system. He continued and said that the combined Earth forces numbered maybe 60 capital ships and 200 smaller vessels, which meant that on paper, humanity was outgunned 5-1. But the way he emphasized the words on paper made it clear that he had something else in mind that might give Earth a fighting chance. Helen repeated his words and asked what he meant by off paper, and a thin smile crossed Jack's face as he explained that these aliens had been fighting other species who apparently evolved without humanity's particular brand of insanity, and that they had never faced an enemy that had been perfecting the art of killing its own kind for 10,000 years of bloody history. Commander Lisa Grant, who was head of the newly formed Space Defense Initiative, stepped forward and asked permission to speak. And when Helen nodded, she explained that the Kavalians did not know about something called the Wolfpack Protocol and did not know about the hidden asteroid bases, and that the aliens thought Earth was humanity's only inhabited world, which was a dangerous assumption on their part. Helen looked around the room at the faces of all the world leaders and representatives and saw fear in their eyes, but also something else that gave her hope, and that something was the same stubborn defiance that had carried the human species through ice ages and plagues and devastating world wars that killed millions. She spoke slowly and with authority and said that perhaps it was time to give these aliens an education about what humanity really was, and she ordered Admiral Jack Peters to implement something called Defensive Protocol 7 and told Commander Lisa Grant to activate all hidden assets throughout the solar system. Helen also told someone to get her a direct line to the Martian colonies and the belt settlements where humans had been living and working for decades in secret, preparation for exactly this kind of threat. and everyone in the room understood that Earth was going to fight back with everything it had. Jack nodded sharply and said he would contact Captain Eric Kane, who commanded a carrier called the Defiant, and he explained that if anyone could bloody the aliens' nose in the first engagement, it would be Eric and his crew, who had trained for years in combat scenarios. As the meeting broke up and leaders rushed to their respective commands to prepare their forces for war, Helen stood alone for a moment and looked up at the ceiling as if she could see through it to the stars beyond, where the alien fleet was approaching, and she thought about the terrible mistake the Kavalians had made. She understood that they had declared war on a species that had turned warfare into an art form over thousands of years of practice, and that humans had built weapons capable of cracking planets open like eggs, and that humanity had looked at the peaceful void of space and immediately wondered how to weaponize every part of it for defense and offense. The Kavalians had declared war on humanity without understanding what that meant, and nobody in their vast empire had warned them about the true nature of the species they were threatening, and nobody had told them that humans had survived and thrived through every extinction event and every disaster that nature could throw at them. Helen walked toward the exit of the assembly hall, knowing that the coming days would be filled with fire and death and sacrifice, but also knowing that humanity would never submit to slavery or subjugation, and that Earth would show these aliens that freedom was worth any price, no matter how high. The war had begun, and the galaxy was about to learn what humans really were beneath their skin and behind their words, and the lesson would be written in fire across the solar system for all to see. Captain Eric Kane stood on the bridge of the Earth carrier Defiant and watched the tactical display with calm eyes, even though his heart was beating faster than normal, and his crew of 200 moved around him with efficient precision because every single person on board was a veteran of the border wars with the breakaway colonies that had happened years. Ag Lieutenant Ben Wright called out from the sensor station that the Kavalian fleet had been detected at Jupiter's orbit, and the count was 412 vessels moving in standard formation, and he added that honestly, sir, it looked like a parade formation rather than a battle formation, which seemed strange for an invasion force. Eric allowed himself a brief smile and told the young lieutenant to relax because, in about 20 minutes, protocol was going to be the least of their concerns. And then he asked what the enemy formation looked like in detail so he could find any weaknesses that might give Earth an advantage. Ben explained that the aliens were using a sphere pattern with battleships on the outer shell and smaller craft toward the center, and the more Eric looked at it, the more he realized that the Kavalians were so confident in their superiority that they were not even worried about an ambush or a surprise attack. Commander Kyle Harris, who was Eric's executive officer, said that the formation looked like a parade because that was exactly what it was, and the aliens were moving so slowly and carefully that they clearly thought humanity would just roll over and surrender without a real fight. Eric pulled up the tactical display and studied the enemy fleet carefully, because years of military training had taught him to look for patterns and weaknesses, and he noticed something important that made his pulse quicken, with the possibility of a devastating first strike. He muttered that the aliens were bunched up too close together, and Kyle leaned in to look at the display, and his eyes widened when he realized what Eric was thinking. And he said that if they could cause a chain reaction, it might take out dozens of ships in one attack. Eric turned to his communications officer and told Lieutenant Amy Foster to get him Admiral Jack Peters immediately, and within moments the Admiral's face appeared on the screen, looking tired but determined and ready for whatever plan Eric had in mind. Eric explained that he was looking at the Kavalian formation and believed they were vulnerable to something called a cascade strike, and he described how detonating a high-yield fusion warhead in the center of their formation might overwhelm their shields with electromagnetic pulse and radiation, long enough for follow-up strikes to destroy multiple ships. Jack's eyes gleamed with interest, and he asked how many ships Eric thought could be destroyed before the aliens scattered and reformed their defensive positions, and Eric said conservatively maybe 50 ships, but optimistically perhaps as many as 100 if everything went perfectly. The Admiral nodded and said that the Wolfpack was already in position on the dark side of Jupiter, waiting for the signal, and he told Eric to execute the plan and make the aliens bleed for their arrogance. And then the connection ended, and Eric turned to face his crew. He announced that all hands should go to battle stations and told navigation to plot a course that would bring the Defiant in fast from below the enemy formation where they would not be expecting an attack, and he ordered weapons to prepare nuclear package Sierra 7 for launch immediately. The Defiant surged forward with its engines burning bright as it accelerated toward the enemy fleet, and alongside it 15 other Earth vessels emerged from concealment behind Jupiter's massive bulk where they had been waiting in silent, running mode for hours. On the bridge, the tension mounted as the distance closed and Eric watched the timer count down, and Ben called out that the Kvalians were hailing them and trying to make contact. But Eric told him to ignore it because talking time was over. He told Danny Price, the young weapons officer, to prepare to fire on his mark, and Danny's hand hovered over the launch button steady, despite this being his first real combat. And he reported that Sierra 7 was armed and ready. Eric gave the order and the missile launched from Defiant's tubes like a sleek arrow of death, and it was a cylinder containing humanity's most destructive non-planetary weapon, and it streaked toward the center of the Kvalian formation at speeds that made it almost impossible to intercept. The Kvalians finally noticed the attack, and their formation began to shift with shields powering up, but they were too slow because they had been too complacent and too confident in their superiority, and they had underestimated human speed and determination. The warhead detonated and space itself seemed to tear open like fabric being ripped apart, and the fusion explosion created a miniature sun that blazed for 3 full seconds and released enough electromagnetic radiation to scramble sensors across the entire solar system. The electromagnetic pulse wave cascaded through the tightly packed Kvalian fleet, and their shields flickered and failed as overlapping energy fields created destructive interference patterns that their technology could not handle, and for a few critical seconds the alien ships were vulnerable. Eric commanded all ships to fire, and the Wolfpack opened up with everything they had, and missiles and railgun rounds hammered into the stunned Kvalian fleet like a storm of metal and fire, and ships that had been invincible moments before now found their shields down and their armor exposed to human weapons. Ben shouted over the chaos that confirmed. Kills were coming in fast with 37, then 42, then 51 alien ships destroyed or crippled, and he added that the enemy was breaking formation and scattering like frightened fish. The Kvalian fleet's perfect sphere dissolved into chaos as ships tried to escape the kill zone. But the damage was already done because 73 ships were destroyed or crippled in those first devastating minutes of combat, and the rest were fleeing toward Mars with their confidence completely shattered. Eric ordered all ships to pursue and harass the enemy, but not to engage their main force directly, and he explained that they should let the aliens run and let them think about what had just happened, and let them report back to their command about the fierce resistance they had encountered. Kyle turned to Eric with a grim smile and said that first blood goes to Earth, and Eric nodded, but there was no joy in his expression because he understood that this was only the beginning, and he knew that the easy part was over. He explained that the Kvalians had underestimated humanity once, but they would not make that mistake again, and he told communications to signal Admiral Jack Peters and tell him that they had gotten the aliens' attention in a big way. As the Defiant and her sister ships broke off pursuit and regrouped, Eric looked at the tactical display showing the fleeing Kvalian fleet, and he thought about the 73 ships destroyed in the opening engagement, which was a victory but also a declaration. Humanity had just announced to the galaxy that Earth would not go quietly into subjugation, and that any species that tried to conquer humans would pay a terrible price in blood and metal and fire. Admiral Vector of the Kvalian Armada stared at the damage reports with growing disbelief and anger that made his crystalline armor pulse red, and he could not understand how 73 ships had been destroyed in a single engagement by primitives, who had not even left their own solar system until recently. He demanded to know how this had happened, and how the humans had destroyed so many of their vessels, and his tactical officer named Ralnik cowered before him and tried to explain that the humans had used a nuclear weapon in close proximity to their formation, which temporarily disabled their shields. Vector slammed his fist on the console and shouted that he already knew what happened, and what he wanted to know was how the humans had the audacity to try such a tactic and how they knew it would work against Kvalian technology. Another officer spoke up nervously and suggested that their intelligence reports indicated humans had been fighting each other for their entire recorded history, and that they had developed extensive experience with nuclear weapons and electromagnetic warfare. that most civilized species had abandoned millennia ago. Vector ordered silence and turned to look at the tactical display showing Earth's solar system. And he noticed that the humans had retreated after their ambush, but sensors showed increased activity throughout the system with ships moving and energy signatures flaring everywhere. He muttered to himself and wondered what other surprises the humans had waiting for his fleet, and the answer came much sooner than he expected or wanted. As the Kavalian fleet regrouped near Mars to assess damage and reform their battle lines, proximity alarms suddenly blared across every ship with a piercing sound that made everyone freeze, and sensors showed that asteroids were deviating from their normal orbits in the belt and accelerating toward the fleet at impossible speeds. Vector shouted for evasive maneuvers, but the asteroids were already too close and they were moving far faster than any natural object should move. And when the first one struck a Kavalian battleship, it was not the impact that destroyed the vessel, but rather the antimatter warhead hidden inside the hollowed-out rock. The explosion tore the battleship in half and sent shock waves through the surrounding ships that made their shields flicker and fail, and more asteroids slammed home, with each one being a hidden bomb that the humans had prepared long before the invasion began. The Kavalians fired wildly at the incoming projectiles and managed to destroy some of them, but they missed others because their targeting systems were designed for conventional warfare and not for weaponized space debris, and 8 more ships were lost before the bombardment finally ended. Ralnek breathed in horrified awe and said that the humans had weaponized asteroids and turned the debris of their own system into bombs, and nobody in the Kavalian fleet had ever encountered such a tactic in all their centuries of conquest. Vector's rage was giving way to something he had rarely felt in his long military career, and that something was doubt about whether this invasion could succeed without catastrophic losses that would weaken the entire Imperium. He realized that these humans were fighting with a creativity and viciousness that defied all tactical doctrine that the Kavalian military had developed over hundreds of years. And the Kavalian way of war had always been straightforward, with superior numbers and superior technology creating overwhelming force that made resistance futile. But the humans were not fighting like any species the Kavalians had conquered before, and they were using tactics that seemed insane and reckless, but were proving devastatingly effective against an enemy that had grown complacent from too many easy victories. The communications officer interrupted Vector's thoughts and reported that they were receiving a transmission from Earth, and it was audio only, which meant the humans wanted to talk, and Vector ordered him to put it through to the bridge. A human voice that was female and calm and measured filled the bridge, and Vector would later learn that it belonged to President Helen Morrison, who was the leader of Earth, and she began speaking with words that carried weight and authority. She said that the Kavalian commander had come to Earth with demands and threats, and that he had believed his military superiority was absolute, but she explained that the Kavalians had made several critical errors in their assessment of humanity. Helen continued and said that first the aliens had assumed humans would be intimidated by their numbers, and second they had assumed humans would fight by rules that the Kavalians were familiar with, and third they had assumed that humans valued their own lives more than their freedom. There was a pause in the transmission that seemed to last forever, and when Helen continued speaking, her voice had turned cold like ice that could cut through metal, and everyone on the Kavalian bridge listened despite their anger. She explained that the Kavalians were facing a species that had survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and plagues that killed half the human population, and that humans had endured 2 world wars that claimed hundreds of millions of lives but had made humanity stronger. Helen said that humans had looked at the atom itself and found a way to make it explode with devastating force, and that they had poisoned their own planet with pollution and war and still thrived, and that humans had killed each other for thousands of years over resources and ideology, and sometimes for no reason at all. She added that through all of this violence and suffering, humanity had never submitted to tyranny without making their oppressors pay a terrible price in blood, and that this pattern had repeated throughout human history from ancient empires to modern dictatorships. Helen stated that the Kavalians had lost over 80 ships in just 2 engagements, which was nearly 20% of their invasion force, and she pointed out that Earth had not even shown them what the main battle fleet could do yet. She said that she was going to make the Kavalian admiral an offer that he should consider carefully, and the offer was simple, which was to turn the fleet around and leave the solar system, and report to the Galactic Council that Earth was not interested in subjugation. Helen told them to explain that humanity would join the galactic community as equals or not at all, and that there would be no middle ground and no compromise on this fundamental principle of human dignity and freedom. Vector found himself asking, what would happen if they refused the offer? And his voice sounded weak even to his own ears, which was shameful for a Kavalian admiral. Helen answered that if they refused, then humanity would show them what total war meant to a species that had been practicing it for 10,000 years, and she promised that humans would hit them with everything they had, using tactics the aliens had never imagined. She said that humanity would sacrifice whatever was necessary to ensure their freedom, and that when the war was over, the Kavalian Imperium would have learned a very expensive lesson about the price of threatening Earth. The transmission ended abruptly and left the bridge in complete silence, and Vector stood there for a long moment while his crew waited for orders that seemed impossible to give. Relnik quietly asked what the Admiral's orders were, and Vector looked at the tactical display where Earth lay ahead like a blue jewel that had seemed so vulnerable when they first detected it. He said that they would send a message to the fleet, telling them to advance on Earth but to do so with all shields at maximum and all sensors active and all weapons ready. And he added that if the humans wanted a war, then the Kavalians would give them a war, but they would not underestimate humanity. Again. As the orders went out, Vector could not shake a growing sense of unease that settled in his chest like a heavy weight, and he wondered what else the humans were hiding in their small corner of space. The war room deep beneath Geneva buzzed with activity, as holographic displays showed the disposition of forces throughout the solar system, and Admiral Jack Peters stood at the center surrounded by commanders from every nation on Earth and every colony beyond it who had gathered for this critical moment. He announced that the Kavalians were 12 hours from Earth orbit and that they had learned their lesson about tight formations because now they were advancing in a dispersed pattern, and they were also scanning constantly for hidden weapons, which meant humanity would not catch them off guard again. Captain Eric Kane's face appeared on one of the communication screens transmitting from the Defiant, and he said that they needed to change tactics and recommended implementing something called Strategy Omega, which everyone knew was dangerous. Several commanders shifted uncomfortably in their seats because Strategy Omega was the nuclear option in the most literal sense, and it involved using Earth's orbital defense platforms to create a kill zone that would be devastating to both sides with massive casualties. Jack admitted that he had been hoping to avoid that strategy, but if they were going to stop the aliens before they reached Earth, then they might not have any other choice, and he asked if anyone had alternative suggestions. General Maria Santos from the Brazilian Space Force spoke up and asked about the lunar railguns, and she wondered if they could use those weapons without revealing the secret moon base that humanity had been building for decades. Jack explained that the moment they fired the railguns, the Kavalians would detect the installation, but at this point secrecy was less important than survival, and he pulled up a new tactical display that showed his complete battle plan. He described how they would use the lunar guns to thin the enemy numbers as they approached, and meanwhile Captain Eric Kane and the main fleet would engage from the interior
orbit of Luna and draw the aliens into a fighting retreat toward
Earth Commander Kyle Harris frowned and said that a retreat would hurt morale among the troops, and he asked if there was not a better way to maintain the fighting spirit of the human forces. Jack replied that the retreat was actually designed to draw the Kavalians into the kill zone, and once they were close enough, humanity would activate the orbital platforms, which consisted of 300 automated weapon satellites, each armed with nuclear missiles and kinetic projectiles. Captain Lauren Mills from the destroyer Vigilant raised her hand and asked about civilian casualties, and she pointed out that if fighting got that close to Earth, there would be massive loss of life among the innocent people living in orbital stations. Jack's voice became heavy as he explained that all civilian stations had been evacuated, and the only people remaining in orbit were military personnel and volunteers, and everyone who stayed knew the risks they were taking. He said that he would not lie to them because this was going to be brutal, and humanity was going to lose people. But if they did not stop the Kavalians here, then the aliens would land, troops on Earth, and then the real nightmare would begin. Eric nodded grimly from his screen and said that his crew was ready and that they would make the aliens work for every mile of space, and Jack looked around at the assembled commanders and told them to pass along a message to their people. He said that humanity was not fighting for territory or resources, but rather fighting because a bunch of aliens had decided that humans were not worthy of freedom, and they were fighting because the Kavalians thought they could bully Earth into submission. Jack added that they were fighting to show the entire galaxy that Earth does not kneel to anyone, and a chorus of affirmatives echoed through the war room from commanders who were ready to give their lives for human freedom. 12 hours later, the Kavalian fleet advanced on Earth, and the Battle of Luna began with fire and fury, and the moon's surface erupted as hidden railgun batteries opened up and revealed their positions to the enemy. Tungsten rods that had been accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed hammered into the Kavalian formation, and shields flared and failed under the kinetic onslaught, and ships broke apart like toys as the devastating weapons tore through their hulls. But the Kavalians pressed forward and returned fire with their plasma cannons that turned the lunar surface into molten glass, and one of the bases took a direct hit and disappeared in a flash of superheated rock and metal that killed 43 personnel instantly. Lieutenant Commander Paul Jensen ordered his people at Lunar Base 3 to keep firing and give the fleet time to get into position, and his gunners worked frantically to reload and fire again, even as enemy weapons struck all around them. In space, the Defiant and her battle group met the Kavalian advance head-on, and Eric watched as his ships formed a staggered line with each vessel, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that would maximize their offensive capability. He ordered all ships to open fire and told them to concentrate on the enemy capital ships, and he specifically instructed Danny Price to maintain continuous launches from the missile boats that accompanied the main fleet. Space lit up with weapons fire that turned the darkness into a light show of death and destruction, and Earth ships, which were smaller and more maneuverable than the Kavalian vessels, darted between the enemy formations, firing and then breaking away before return fire could track them. It was a strategy borrowed from ancient naval warfare that emphasized hit-and-run tactics where you never stayed still and always kept the enemy off balance. And for a while it worked perfectly. But the Kavalians were learning fast, and their targeting systems adapted to human tactics, and their formations tightened to provide better mutual defense, and Earth ships began to fall as the aliens figured out how to counter human maneuvers. The frigate Resolute exploded in a ball of fire, taking 70 souls with it, and the destroyer Hammer lost its engines and drifted helplessly until a Kavalian beam weapon cut it in half like a knife through paper. Kyle reported with a tight voice that they were losing too many ships, and he told Eric that they needed to fall back before the entire fleet was destroyed in a futile stand. Eric agreed and said that falling back was exactly the plan, and he ordered all ships to begin a fighting retreat toward Earth while making the aliens think that humanity was breaking under the pressure. The Earth fleet turned and began to withdraw while continuing to fire as they went, and the Kavalians, sensing victory, pressed their advantage hard, and their fleet surged forward, closing the distance to Earth rapidly. Eric muttered that the aliens were taking the bait and told his crew to hold steady, and he watched the tactical display as the enemy moved deeper into the trap that humanity had prepared. Back on Earth, Admiral Jack watched the same display with icy calm, even though his heart was racing, and he saw that the Kavalian fleet was entering the kill zone, and he prepared to give the order that would change everything. He said quietly that this was going to be close, and he told all orbital platforms to prepare to activate, and then he gave the order and said now with absolute authority. Earth's orbital defense grid came to life all at once like a sleeping giant awakening, and 300 weapons platforms that had been hidden among debris and old satellites suddenly activated, and nuclear missiles launched by the dozens while kinetic kill vehicles accelerated toward their targets. Laser batteries began firing in continuous pulses that created visible beams in the thin atmosphere, and the Kavalian fleet found itself in a devastating crossfire with ships exploding on all sides as Earth's hidden arsenal unleashed hell itself. But the aliens were not helpless, and their shields absorbed incredible punishment, and their weapons returned fire with equal fury, and platform after platform winked out of existence as the Kavalians fought back desperately. A technician reported that they were losing 40% of the orbital platforms as the Kavalian weapons tore through the defensive grid, and Jack acknowledged this with a grim nod. but told everyone to look at the enemy fleet on the tactical display because the aliens were suffering far worse. The Kavalian fleet was in complete chaos with nearly 100 ships destroyed and many more damaged, and their perfect formations had shattered into a disorganized mess as captains tried desperately to escape the kill zone that humanity had created. Their advance had stopped cold as the reality of Earth's defensive capabilities became horrifyingly clear, and then Eric's fleet turned around and came back at them from behind, while the platforms continued hammering them from the front in a devastating pincer movement. Eric commanded all ships to go full offensive and hit the aliens with everything they had, and the Earth fleet tore into the Kavalian rearguard with missiles and railguns and laser fire that carved through damaged shields like they were paper. The battle raged for 6 brutal hours that felt like an eternity to everyone involved, and when it finally ended, the Kavalian fleet was in full retreat, having lost over half their original invasion force in the desperate fight for Earth. Humanity had won the battle, but the cost was terrible, with 45 ships destroyed and 18 orbital platforms eliminated, and over 4,000 personnel had died defending their home world from alien conquest. In the war room, Jack slumped in his chair and suddenly felt every one of his 60 years weighing on him like a physical burden, and he ordered someone to get him complete casualty reports and to find out where the Kavalians were headed in their retreat. A sensor officer called out with excitement in his voice that the Kavalian fleet was leaving the solar system completely, and he said that they were retreating and that Earth had won, and the room erupted in cheers and celebrations. Jack raised his hand for silence and said that they had won the battle, but the war was not over yet, and he explained that the aliens would go back and regroup and maybe come at humanity with an even bigger fleet next time. He said that Earth needed to prepare for round 2, but even as he spoke those words, Jack allowed himself a small smile, because humanity had faced the Kavalian Imperium's vaunted armada and sent them running back to their home territory. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity was not prey to be hunted and conquered, and instead humans were predators who had clawed their way to the top of their own food chain through millions of years of evolution and violence. 3 weeks after the Battle of Earth, a different scene was unfolding light years away, and Ambassador Zekther stood before the Galactic Council in a massive chamber that orbited a neutral star system, and his crystalline armor was dimmed with shame. Around him, representatives of 47 different species waited in the council chamber, and Council Leader Murthal, who was an ancient being whose species had been exploring space for 30,000 years, looked at Zekther with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Murthal demanded an explanation, and pointed out that Zekther had brought an armada of 400 ships to subjugate one small world, but returned with only 167, and he asked what had happened to cause such catastrophic losses. Zekther took a deep breath and admitted that they had underestimated the humans, and he said that the species of Earth was not what anyone had expected them to be. Murthal gestured to the holographic display and told Zekther to show the council what had happened, and the chamber darkened as footage from the battle began to play for all the assembled representatives to witness. The council watched in silence as the initial ambush unfolded, with the nuclear detonation that crippled dozens of ships, and they saw the weaponized asteroids strike and the orbital defense grid activate, and many of the peaceful species gasped in horror at the violence. Zekther explained that the humans had weaponized everything in their solar system, including their own asteroids and their orbital space, and he said that humans had been fighting wars against themselves for so long that warfare was ingrained in their very culture at a fundamental level. He continued and said that humanity did not just have a military, but rather their entire civilization was organized around the concept of conflict and survival, and they had developed weapons and tactics that were completely foreign to civilized galactic society. A council member from the peaceful Varethi species spoke up and said that humans were primitives who had barely achieved faster-than-light travel, and surely such a young species could not pose a real threat to the established powers of the galaxy. Zekther corrected him and explained that humans did not actually have faster-than-light travel at all, and that they had not left their own solar system with anything except probes and slow-generation ships, and yet they had still defeated a Kavalian invasion force using only sub-light technology. Another counselor asked how such a thing was possible, and Admiral Vektar, who had accompanied Zekther to the council, stepped forward to explain the terrible truth that the Kavalian military had learned. Vector said that humans did not fight the way civilized species fought, and he explained that every species in the council had achieved space travel only after reaching a certain level of social evolution, where they became peaceful and cooperative, and war became rare. He continued and said that humans had reached space while still fighting amongst themselves, and that they had split the atom not for power generation, but specifically for weapons, and that their first space programs were actually disguised missile development programs. Vector said that humans looked at the stars and saw tactical advantages rather than wonder, and that they approached every problem with a militaristic mindset that came from thousands of years of constant warfare. The holographic display shifted to show footage from the retreat that had been captured by Kvalian sensors, and it showed a damaged Earthship called the Destroyer Vigilant ramming itself into a Kvalian cruiser rather than allow itself to be destroyed, and both ships exploded in a ball of fire. Vector said that humans were willing to die, and not just willing but sometimes eager to sacrifice themselves, and he explained that they called it duty and honor, and that the Kvalians had thought this was a weakness but had been terribly wrong. He said that human willingness to sacrifice was actually their greatest strength, because it made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways that peaceful species could never match. Mirthal was silent for a long moment as he processed this information, and then he asked if Zecthar was telling the council that they could not defeat this human species. Zecthar replied carefully and said that they could defeat humanity, but the cost would be unthinkable, and he explained that it would require thousands of ships instead of hundreds, and they would need to be prepared for tactics that had never been encountered before. He added that even with overwhelming force, the humans would make them pay for every planet and every moon and every asteroid in their system, and that humanity would turn their entire solar system into a weapon rather than surrender. Zecthar straightened his posture and proposed that they leave Earth alone and establish a quarantine zone around the human system, and he suggested telling humanity that they could join the galactic community when they were ready on their own terms. Someone from the council shouted that this was cowardice and that they should not let primitives dictate terms, but Zecthar shot back that he was trying to prevent a pointless war that would cost thousands of lives. The council erupted into argument, with some agreeing with Zecthar while others called for a larger military response, and the debate raged for hours without resolution. Meanwhile, back on Earth, President Helen Morrison sat in the Oval Office with Admiral Jack Peters and Captain Eric Kane, who had been recalled from the Defiant for this meeting. Jack reported that the Kvalian fleet had completely withdrawn from sensor range, and their probes suggested the aliens had returned to their home territory, and he said simply that Earth had won. Helen asked what the cost had been, and Jack replied that 4,237 people were dead, and 63 ships were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, and 2 lunar bases were gone along with most of their nuclear arsenal. Helen nodded slowly and said that they had sent a message to the galaxy that Earth was not to be trifled with, and Eric asked what would happen now. Helen said that they would prepare for another attack, but they would also reach out to the Galactic Council, and she explained that if the aliens would not come to Earth in peace, then humanity would go to them instead. She asked Jack how long it would take to retrofit existing ships for long-range exploration, and Jack said maybe 2 years with the right resources, and he pointed out that humanity still did not have faster-than-light drives. Helen smiled and said that humans had never been good at waiting for permission, and she explained that they would build generation ships or figure out faster-than-light technology themselves through research and determination. She walked to the window and looked up at the sky and said that the Kvalians had made a mistake because they thought humans were primitives hiding on one small world, and they had not realized that humanity had been looking up at the stars for millennia, dreaming of the day they could reach them. Helen turned back to face the 2 officers and said that nothing would stop humanity from our